The fact that they rejected, Trump, who's Adolf Hitler, who's a convicted felon, who's the worst person on earth, the fact that they reelected him just showed that we won. We won that battle. And that means that the field is open to creatives. And the question now is, we've done the negative work of exposing them. Will we do the positive work of building the infrastructure we need to have a real culture?
What a treat this week. It's really important for us to pay attention to politics, to policy. It's what we do at Heritage. But those of you who have been listening to this show, watching this show for, 3 years we've been doing this? God bless you. Know that what I really care about is culture. And the reason for that is politics is downstream from culture. I know one of the influences on me professionally, and I would say increasingly personally because of his own witness in that regard, but constant reminder in his own work, is someone that I just had the opportunity for the first time to shake hands with, and that's Andrew Klavan of the Daily Wire, award-winning screenwriter, best-selling author. It really is an honor to welcome you to Heritage.
Oh, thank you very much. It's great to be here.
Now, I've set the standard really high,
yeah, now
Andrew,
I feel
so
embarrassed.
good luck living up to that, right?
I think I'll just scuttle away with it.
Thanks for being here. I'm going to get to the question that I love asking guests because I guess it's the Southerner in me knowing that everyone has a story and every story is interesting, especially in the United States. But before we get to that, I'm real curious to ask you, what's your assessment in this very short time that Donald Trump has been back in office of how things are shifting, not just with politics and policy. I think that's fairly obvious, but potentially with society and culture.
Yeah, no, it's a big, big deal. It's a dam breaking. There's no question about it. The night Trump was elected, this kind of sense of peace came over me, which I don't get a lot, and certainly not while watching politics. But it didn't really have to do with Donald Trump, although it wouldn't have happened without him, of course. But it had to do with the complete rejection of a entertainment and news media that has become dishonest, corrupt, leftist in the worst possible sense of that word, and that it's ideological. It's not just bad ideology, but it's rigid ideology. And they threw everything they could at him, but they forgot that a new media had grown up and it had really exposed them. The new media doesn't have the reporting power that the old media has. It certainly doesn't have the distribution power of Hollywood, but it does have the ability now to expose them and what they're doing every step of the way. So no matter what they did, and I've always compared what we were doing to the American Revolution. We're sort of popping up behind the rocks and taking a shot at this empire marching in rows. But that's exactly what we did. Every time they came out with another lie, we exposed it. And once Elon Musk got in the game and once X turned over, you could feel the tide shifting. And the fact that they rejected Trump, who's Adolf Hitler, who's a convicted felon, who's the worst person on earth, the fact that they reelected him just showed that we won. We won that battle. And that means that the field is open to creatives. It means the field is open to journalists, and culture commentators. And the question now is, we've done the negative work of exposing them. Will we do the positive work of building the infrastructure we need to have a real culture?
That is always harder, it seems to me, for conservatives. It's hard enough leaning on Edmund Burke here for conservatives to sustain a governing majority, actually just a governing coalition. And obviously when he made that observation, he was thinking about a period 230, 40 years ago. But I also think about his native land today, where the conservatives were in power, capital C conservatives were in power for 14 years. And with each passing year, in the political and policy realm, they actually became more like the radical left. And so it isn't just that the left has marched through the institutions, as Gramsci said, it's that they marched through our conservative political institutions themselves. Believe it or not, in spite of that long throat clearing, it's related to what you just said, which is that we have to always be leaning forward, always be on offense, especially now that we have the advantage with, as you say, the new media. What do we need to do? Like people in the audience who, of course, have very important roles, whatever they're doing, wherever they are, but maybe they're not in D.C. What can they be doing individually to make sure that we press the advantage?
Well, for one thing, and that is something a drum I've been beating for over 20 years, is we need to build a cultural infrastructure. We have none. We have think tanks all over the place. They deal with very specialized things. They deal with municipal, governance. They deal with legal theory and all this stuff. We don't have a single think tank that deals with the culture. just before he died, one of the last conversations I had with Andrew Breitbart, who was famous for making that comment repeatedly that politics is downstream from culture. He asked me, would you head a cultural institute? Now, I think I'm probably the worst person to ask that question, but I jumped at the chance, not because I thought I would be any good at it, but because I thought we need that so desperately. Artists work for love. If you ever look at the people in Hollywood, they make movie after movie, left-wing movie after movie that bombs. Their movies bomb. All the movies against the wars on terror, they all bombed. All the leftist movies bombed. If you look at the movies that have just been nominated for Academy Awards, movies about transgenderism, about sex work, as they now call it, about brutalist architecture, no one went to see them, but they just nominate them because that's where the prestige is, that's where the love is, that's where the girls are, and that's where you're going to get the big award and get this. Show your mom you stood up on TV and made a speech. We have nothing like that. We don't even have an award for like the best, conservative work that came out, let alone just work that we like, So artists get no love from us. They get, people are always saying to me, I don't have to go to the movies. I can watch Turner Classics. And I think, well, great, but don't expect anybody to make any movies that you're going to want to watch now, And so we haven't got the infrastructure for artists. We haven't got the funding for artists. Artists need grants sometimes. They need support. And we haven't got and because of all that, we haven't got the culture that's required to welcome artists. Conservative art does not look like conservative life. I've been married 50 years. I adore my wife. I love my kids. I'm a very conservative guy. I don't write that story. That's not an interesting story. Macbeth is an interesting story, and it's not a conservative
story. And it's
story.
enduring.
And it's enduring, exactly. And so we know when we go to see Macbeth, because it's old, conservatives get like, oh yeah, I guess I like this story. But when The Sopranos comes on and does virtually the same thing and brilliantly, we kind of recoil and say a lot of cursing, a lot of sex and all that stuff. But that's the world we're living in. And so you have to let artists do what they do, and you have to build the structure to welcome them, fund them, and love them.
How did you come to this realization professionally?
Well,
and which is another way of asking the question about your story.
Well, I had this really interesting advantage in the 90s when political correctness, as they called it then, which sort of made its first real upsurge, early 90s. I was sitting with my wife at a dinner party, and we had just had our son, and we had already had a daughter. And I said, boys and girls are really different. And the dinner table went silent. I mean, just silent, because everybody was embarrassed because you weren't supposed to say that anymore. Feminism had decreed that that was not a sayable thing. And I walked out and I turned to my wife and I said, baby, we're leaving the country. I am not going to live in a country where I can't say the simplest thing.
Which is obvious to anyone.
Little did I know how bad it was going to get. But we left. So we left the country when we went to England. And we were there. We meant to go for a year just to get a break from it. And we were there for 7 years. I fell in love with London. It was just a wonderful place. We had a great time. But I became immersed in British culture. My kids went to British schools. My friends were all British. I was reading the British newspapers. I wasn't really paying attention to the Clinton years at all. I didn't see them at all.
Good for you.
Yeah, I know. It was quite relaxing. And I came home right around the turn of the century. And about a year later, 9/11 happened. I'm sitting there and I'm writing screenplays. We went to Hollywood. I said, let's, I kind of write screenplays in my spare time. Let's go to Hollywood while I'm still young enough to be in the business, and let's go there. So I get there, and I start doing very well. And 9/11 happens, and about 3 days after it happens, David Letterman, remember him, the late night comedian?
Used to watch the show.
He comes on and he says, I have to think about this out loud for a minute. Why do these people hate us? And I thought, what do you mean? They're fascists, they're Nazis, they're horrible, horrible people. They're supposed to hate us. It's a point of pride that they should hate us. That is, we are the people who the Japanese bombed at Pearl Harbor for a reason. This is why we should take pride in this and we should fight back. But I realized at that moment that while I was gone, in a way that I could see, but people who were the frogs who had been in the pan while the temperature was being turned up slowly couldn't see, the culture had disappeared. Now, I had gone right without knowing it. I had changed from a liberal to a right.
Common story.
Without even knowing it, because I was overseas, so I wasn't involved in American politics. I was just going by my own lights. And when I came back, suddenly the only people who made sense to me were National Review, Rush Limbaugh, you guys. I was suddenly paying attention, thinking, I don't even know who these people are, but they keep saying what I believe. And so I realized that this was a cultural problem, that you shouldn't have to follow Ronald Reagan where the president says, I want a kinder, gentler nation. What could have been kinder and gentler than the booming economy and peace that Reagan brought? You shouldn't have a guy like George W. Bush saying, I'm a compassionate conservative, as if conservatism weren't inherently compassionate. That's a cultural problem. And when you're apologizing for being right, when you're apologizing for being free, when you're apologizing for being the best country, you're not going to stay that way long, because those are things that require, just as you said, they require leaning forward, they require defense, because they are living things and they die naturally. They naturally decay. Leftism is a form of decay. It's always easy for power to rise to the top. So I started making speeches to people who I literally had never heard of before, like, the City Journal people and things like that. And I just started getting up and saying, look, I'm working in Hollywood, and you can't make a movie supporting America. You can't make a movie in which God, when people sit down to eat, that they say grace. You can't do it. And this is affecting everything that you think. It's not just the people you don't like are thinking this way. You're thinking this way because that's the way culture works. And they looked at me, and this is like more than 20 years ago. And they looked, I said to my wife, they looked at me the way she looks at me when I try to explain to her that even when you buy something on sale, it costs money. You're not saving money.
And you've been married 50 years.
Married 50 years. And my wife looks at me and she thinks, God, you're cute and I love you, but I have no idea what you're talking about. And that's the way they looked at me. They thought it was cool that somebody from Hollywood would show up, but they had no idea what I was talking about. And I found myself talking out loud about the fact that Hollywood was now doing what I think was one of the worst things it ever did as an industry. It was making movies against our soldiers while our soldiers were in the field getting shot at.
It's treasonous.
It was abhorrent. And again, you don't have to support the war. You can be virulently against it, but you don't make propaganda narratives while our sons and sometimes daughters are being blown up. It didn't happen in Vietnam. All those guys came home. And first of all, guys like Oliver Stone had been grunts. They had a right to speak. These were people who'd never been anywhere besides Sunset Boulevard. They were sitting around the Chateau Marmont going, oh, that George W. Bush, he's such a fool, And I was in rooms where you'd walk in and people ask if there's a blacklist in Hollywood. No, not exactly. But the way it works is you walk in, and as you and I walked in, we chatted for a little while. But the chat would be like, isn't George W. Bush worse than Hitler?
They get straight to that. It's just like academia.
How is the traffic? Isn't George W. Bush, And I would go like, I don't know. I kind of think he's got the right of this one, This is kind of an easy one. And I started writing about the fact that they were making these movies. I went to Afghanistan and was embedded with the troops just so I could speak with authority. That's the only reason I did it. And my Hollywood career, which was then a high $6 and $7 million career, ended like that. I mean, like that. The phone went off.
All it took was a few of those conversations.
Yeah. A few of those conversations. And again, is it a blacklist? No. It just means that somewhere in the impossible process of selling a screenplay, you're going to get stopped. And it was rough. I mean, we had to sell our house. We had to move. It was like it was the real thing. But it never occurred to me like, oh, I'm not going to do this anymore, because it was insane. It was insane. And so that's kind of how I'm a writer. I would spend every day in my room. I'm a hermit. I would spend every day with my imagination, making up stories, writing them down. That's how I got to be in front of a camera, which I never wanted to be, talking and, writing these funny videos and things like that. And it just kind of blossomed once the Daily Wire found me. It just kind of blossomed into a major part of my career, but it was nothing I had expected.
I want to come back to this important conversation thread about how we build up a culture. Yeah. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of the bottom line up front about the conversation that we've not scripted, but intend to have. But I'm really curious about you as a creative, because I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of creatives, including here at Heritage, including people, behind the camera in the studio. And I'm not that kind of person. And I say that respectfully of those of you who are. But what I know about, I think every other creative I know is that y'all know at an early age, that's what your passion is. Whether it's writing or drawing or some sort of art, it seems like that was the case for you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Right after I got over wanting to be a cowboy and an astronaut.
Yeah, sure, which is natural. Yeah.
And then I wanted to be a writer. Yeah.
So what do you say to people out there? And the reason for that question is for people in the audience who have that passion, who are politically, culturally conservative. And even though that seems to be improving, opportunities seem to be improving, although we'll check that claim in a minute. What advice do you have for them?
Well, there's no beating the system. Like I drives me crazy when people call me up and say, I'm going to start a conservative publishing house, but we're going to fly beneath the radar. And I go, the radar goes right down to the ground. You're not flying anywhere. That's not happening. But you can't beat the system. You can't change the system, but you can beat the system. The new technology gives people the power to reach so many people without going through any kind of gatekeepers or structure. Most people don't have the talent to do it. You've got to start there. But some people do. I mean, within 2-3 years, you're going to be able to make a movie by yourself, with voices and characters and video and all this stuff. There are new technologies growing up. I'm sure you've seen these things where you put on a mask and you're in this 3D world. If I were starting now, that's what I'd be working on, because I think that that's a kind of visual storytelling art that nobody's really explored yet. And when I say this to conservatives, it's like telling them that the sound movies are going to catch on. They go like, sound, nobody cares about sound. I mean, that's what it's like. These new technologies are everything. You can build books that have videos in them. You can put out books and publish them yourselves. We don't really need the publishing houses. But once we break through and once we start doing the kinds of things that you can now do individually, the bigs will come around. The only reason they don't come around is because they don't have to, because nobody competes with them. But once somebody makes a movie and puts it online and gets, 3 million hits, they'll want him on their side. And he's not going to, even a really interesting lesson in this was Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ. Now, obviously, Gibson had power and prestige, and he had money. He could take $25 million out of his pocket and make that movie. But after it took off, I always say they treated Jesus better in that movie than they treated Gibson. They just they crucified him, and it had nothing to do with all his flaws. All artists have flaws, and all his dark spaces and all that had to do with Jesus. They wanted to shut that story down, and yet they started to build in-house faith-based divisions to try and cash in on some of that money. Now, a lot of times it didn't work because they hated God so much that they couldn't do it with a straight face. But the Christians caught on, and the Christians have been the one outlying successful group that has made movies against the tide. And you can say those movies are not very good. A lot of them are squirrely, smiley-faced, Christian movie. You fall in love with Jesus and everything's all right and all that stuff. However, they created an audience. And some of these days, artists are going to come along and co-opt that audience for better work. Just like the novel used to be a sort of entertainment until Jane Austen came along and turned it into a work of genius. Then suddenly the novel becomes the major art form of that century. So the Christians have done us all a favor by showing how these outsider venues and outsider pathways to success are built. But all of us can do it. It's so cheap, so easy now, and the technology is there for individuals to act. So all I'm saying is a guy who sits in a room and says, oh, I can't get through, and how do I do this, and who do I meet, and whose hand do I shake? I think, no. If you got to make something, build it. If you build it, they will come. I think that if it's good enough, most people aren't that good. And I think that's disappointing, obviously, for people. There are probably as many people who have made their living doing what I do as play professional baseball. I mean, it's not an easy path. But once you start to turn your back on those people, you can do it. And it'll continue. It'll get easier.
So in spite of that tough cut, I mean, I was thinking even before you said the baseball reference, very few people really make a living out of that, which is to say, two things. Number one, hats off to those of you with the talent, but implied in that comment is that even if someone has as their creative outlet, their passion, writing and storytelling, that can be it's intrinsic good for them to pursue that, even if they're not able to commercialize that. And that's really important for us to do. I want to come back to that point in a minute, but I want to stay on this path, Andrew, about how we build this culture. Really the sort of the commodified part of the culture, the storytelling, the movies, stories. And I want to test a claim that I made a few minutes ago, which is that its opportunities are improving. But you seem at least a little skeptical of that.
No, I think they're improving. Right now, it's like blades of grass bursting through the ice.
It's not overwhelming.
It's not overwhelming, but I think this is a moment when it's only going to take one or two people to say, like, maybe in our conservative division, we should put in some fiction. Maybe we're going to make movies. Here's a story to tell. This is the funniest thing. One of my favorite stories about Hollywood. When they started making all these anti-war on terror films, and there were at least a dozen of them, but probably more. The Green Zone, the Lions for Lambs, one after another. Evil Republicans.
There were a lot of them. You're reminding me of that.
Oh my God! Redaction, Redemption. All the same names. They were just terrible, terrible movies. They all bombed. I'm sitting reading the trade paper Variety, and it says audiences don't want to hear about the wars on terror. So then Clint Eastwood makes American Sniper, which I think is a terrific film.
It is.
I think it's now the third highest grossing R-rated film ever made. It was for a while, I think, maybe the highest. Variety puts out an article going, this is strange because we thought people didn't want to see films about the war on terror. Yeah, they didn't want to see films about the war on terror in which the jihadis were the good guys and we were the bad guys, because it wasn't true. It was not, people are willing to take a critical look at their country and they're willing to take a critical look at their culture, but that was just a lie. And American Sniper is a complex film. It's not a rah-rah film. It's not a jingoistic film. It's not a conservative film in the fact that it says, and so go out there and, vote conservative, folks. It's just a film about a man doing his job in a very, very difficult situation. And it's really good.
It's a powerful film.
But they never learned that that was the secret. They never, why is this happening? Why is this happening? And it's remarkable. It's remarkable. So that's what you're up against. And when I talk about infrastructure, that's the infrastructure that has to change. But I don't want to be negative at all. I think if you consider that I started doing this right after 9/11, the difference is black and white. I mean, now people get it. Now when you say the culture, people say, yes, the culture. They don't know what to do about it. They don't want to do the small things. They don't want to do the important things. And, you go in, I've given speeches to millionaires and billionaires, and at the end they come up and say, well, what can we give you? And I think, I don't want you to give me anything. Build a publishing house, build a movie company. I don't want you to pay for my projects. I make money off my projects. I know how to do this, but build something where people like me can go and be welcome.
And that's really the opportunity for people with that kind of capital, with a lot of zeros at the end, many of whom have been involved in politics, that is to say, specifically political donors. And they often come to us at Heritage and say, Kevin, in addition to that, in addition to supporting public policy work at Heritage and other aligned groups, we realize even that's not enough. I mean, it's very much, I think, proving the thesis that you're stating here. What do we do with our money? And what we're trying to do at Heritage is not only broaden the field of center-right organizations and institutions. Education, as you know, is a big passion of mine, but also direct them to opportunities to affect the culture. And so I think about a really good friend of mine, Christian McGuigan, who's been on this show. He's come to a couple of Heritage events, who's building a new film studio. His purpose is not to do Christian conservative film. His purpose is to do great film that Christians and or conservatives or just sort of normal people who like common sense would enjoy seeing.
Yeah.
That's really the objective, right?
You tell great stories. I mean, you tell great stories. Most great stories are conservative because life is conservative. Conservatism is actually a theory of.
That's a heck of a way to go through life.
That applies to life, yeah. But what the left does is they take those and they change the values in them. So if you take a look at a film like V is for Vendetta, it's about fighting tyranny. It's about, standing up for yourself. It's about standing up against the government. But everything that actually is conducive to freedom, like Christianity, is shown to be evil. And everything that is conducive to not freedom, like, blowing things up, like blowing up Parliament, is shown to be the way toward freedom. So all they do is they switch the values around. All we have to do is put the real values in there, and people will show up like crazy. And so telling great stories is clearly the way to go. There are great conservative. I mean, Cormac McCarthy, terrific writer, obviously a conservative. I happen to know that he was a conservative. I mean,
good to get that confirmed.
Yeah, but he wanted the Nobel Prize, I guess, and he didn't want to say it. There are plenty of people out there. Yeah.
Yeah. My wife says, "How can you love Cormac McCarthy?" I said, "The same reason that I love Flannery O'Connor.
Exactly.
The same reason I still love Macbeth."
Yep.
To your earlier point, these are real human stories.
Right.
We learn from the challenges, the human condition, right? That's part of storytelling.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, storytelling, it is amazing. It's amazing what you learn just by watching movies, reading books, novels, by reading fiction. So many conservatives think it's a waste of time. I cannot tell you how many times I've gone on to try and plug a novel on some, Friends TV show or radio show, and they'll say on the air, "I never read fiction." And you think, well, you're actually missing out on a way of understanding life that is essential. It is amazing. If you watch me at the Daily Wire, talk to guys at the Daily Wire who only read polls, I'm right more often about what's going to happen.
I bet you are.
But only because I'm watching TV, I'm watching Netflix. I see where people are going, even when the Hollywood wants them to go a different way. And it's an amazing way of facing the world. It's sort of, I guess it's the right brain way of facing the world, where you get the whole picture, not just this, congressional district in Ohio.
It's really important. I often encourage my colleagues, in addition to telling them, and a reminder to me, of course, too, to get outside, touch some grass, to also read fiction. And that's not because I came up with that idea. It's because I had a friend of mine, as I was getting into public policy, he said, "Kevin, you're already just so focused on rational thought, and you read the news and a bunch of nonfiction, read fiction." And I've started doing that. I actually have kept that discipline. Yep. And I think about, there are a lot of examples I could cite. We mentioned Cormac McCarthy, Flannery O'Connor. I was just outside her childhood home in Savannah, which is a little bit of a pilgrimage. But this tremendous book from the mid-19th century, Thomas Hardy, who was a contemporary of Jane Austen. Yeah, sure. Probably not quite the novelist she was, but this underappreciated classic is like a near great book, The Mayor of Casterbridge.
Oh yeah, no,
it's a powerful.
He's a terrific writer. Yeah.
I was in the last couple of chapters, and I told my family, I said, "This is such a moving, kind of disturbing story." And my teenage daughter said, "Well, Dad, why?" And I said, "Because, well, first of all, this could be any of us, but I said, this could be any elected official in the United States today."
Yeah.
Which is not actually to throw them under the bus. It's that he was so good at depicting the human condition. And so I mention that not only to give, reading suggestions to the audience, which they sometimes ask for, but also to say this, that using stories in our arena at Heritage of public policy and watching polls and news is something that we can always be better at. It might actually make us a lot more effective, right?
It makes us so much more effective. And it also helps us to understand what our utterly corrupt press is doing. So, how do you tell when you should vote for somebody even though he had an affair? Like, how do you tell when that story is not important? I mean, obviously, I believe, thou shalt not commit adultery. That has nothing to do with it. How do I know? Well, yeah, okay, he did that, and I'm sorry about that, but that's not my problem.
But we're voting for an elected official, not a pastor.
That's right.
Yeah.
So the press knows how to tell stories. They only tell one story. They only tell one side of the story. It's amazing how corrupt the news media is, because I worked in the news media coming up. I was a newspaper man in a small town, and the left-wing reporters would scold you if you went too far left. I mean, it was just, and the guys that I worked with all went on to become, famous reporters, and they were very strict about it. And then sort of it all went bad. And this is the thing that happened while I was kind of out of the country, the turning point that came.
Do you think that, this is switching gears only slightly, I at least intend the question to be very related to this. Do you think part of Donald Trump's genius as president is that he's also a cultural icon?
Oh, there's no question.
It's a representation, a representation of the age, but also he's touched upon that frustration that Americans have about films that have been made, but also is great at telling stories.
Yeah. Well, he's a walking story. I mean, he's the avatar of one part of our culture, and all the things that make me resistant to him have all turned out to be good things, which I kind of recognized pretty early. I mean, I didn't like the rudeness, I didn't like the cruel, the names and all that stuff, but I kept saying to people, the culture has gone so bad that only a guy as boorish as this is willing to take the slings and arrows that you have to take simply by saying the simplest things, like maybe you should cut taxes, like maybe, you shouldn't cripple business, like maybe the government should be smaller so that people can be more free. In order to say those things, which were obviously things that in my youth, one half of the country would easily say, you had to be ready to be called a racist, which is one of the worst things you can be called in America. And Trump was just too, turtle skinned to actually care. And I think that is an amazing thing. And he was that part of that culture that I know from New York, and I'm a New Yorker, I know exactly who those people are, that just does not care what you say about them because he's just going to tell you the truth. And it's a beautiful thing. And by the way, when you leave the coasts in this country, you see it all over the place. I mean, you only have to be away from the coast for 5 minutes to talk to somebody who'll just say, yeah, they did this because the black guy wanted that, or that, and just things that people won't say anymore in California and New York. And Trump is that guy. And I think that he is an icon. You do remember that before he became a politician, the rappers loved him. He was in Home Alone 2, I think it was. He was mentioned all the time. He was kind of the Rockefeller. You used to say he's like Rockefeller, then you said he's like Trump. And so he was the culture. He carried it with him. He didn't need Hollywood to bolster him up. He could face them down, and it was really remarkable to watch him do it.
So what do we do with all of these lessons for the future of America and really the near-term future of America? What do we need to be doing with storytelling, with our politics, with our culture, with our own rebuilding of our communities, which is sort of my focus these days? And I lean not just on your intellect on this, but also your experience, because you've been in a lot of different industries, a lot of different arenas, and you're a very close observer and analyst of what's going on. And ultimately, what we always try to do at Heritage, and certainly on this show, is have a nice conversation, but also give folks food for thought about what they might be able to do different.
Yeah. Well, one thing, and I say this reluctantly because people don't hear what I'm actually saying, but let me say it and then I'll explain it. We have to start talking freely about God. And the reason I say that is there is a God, and without God, without the acknowledging freely and easily and naturally the existence of God, all the stuff that the left says makes sense. Like, why can't a man become a woman? You're just a piece of clay. If I change the piece of clay, why is it now something different than it was before? And conservatives are always making this argument, well, it's unnatural. Well, air conditioning is unnatural. That's not an argument.
But it's a gift from God.
It's a gift from God, exactly. What we believe is that the fact that there are men and women is good. That's what we actually believe. We believe that it is a good thing that there is femininity, and a good thing that there's masculinity, and a good thing that those two things are appeal to one another and fit together in this complementary way. And in order to make that, you have to believe that there's something about creation that was a good idea, that maybe it's gone wrong, but still this is a good idea. And when we allowed prayer to go out of the schools, when we allowed the Supreme Court to start making these absurd and completely nonsensical rules that, you can't put up a cross here, if you put up a Christmas decoration, you have to put up a satanic decoration as well. That's insane, When we had every story in which, like I remember watching Justified, a terrific television show, and at the end of the first season, the guy turns to the hero and said, Nick Searcy, my pal, a great guy, turns to the hero and says, do you believe in God? And there's a pause, and he goes, yes, I do. And I thought, wow.
Something that simple.
Yes, because now you understand something about the way he's thinking. We do not write stories with a moral framework unless we're moralists. And that moralism is dull, but morality is real. And so when I watched this picture that's been nominated for an Oscar. I think it's called Nora, and it's about a sex worker, a prostitute. She's a low-level prostitute. She lap dances and things like this. But for the first half hour to 45 minutes, it's pornographic. It's not titillating because it's boring, but it is. I mean, it's just one sex scene after another, very graphic, and just a way of normalizing this field of endeavor. Well, at no point would anyone in Hollywood dare to say, it's actually wrong to do that to yourself. It's wrong, even if it's legal. It's wrong to do it to yourself. And those are things that actually come up when people believe in God. And so let's go back to Macbeth, all right? Because first of all,
everything can come back.
Everything
to Macbeth.
can come back to Macbeth, right? Macbeth makes the greatest nihilist speech in the history of literature, right? Tomorrow and tomorrow, tomorrow. Life is a tale told by an idiot, signifying nothing. Now you could say, well, Shakespeare said that life is a tale told, but no, Shakespeare did not say that. What he said was that when you absent yourself from the moral order, life becomes meaningless. And only he could write it, so it was so beautiful that you can't believe it. You were listening to it, but that's a very different thing, because when you kill somebody in Shakespeare, he comes back to haunt you. It doesn't mean the bad guys don't win. The bad guys sometimes get away with it. Iago is never really punished the way he deserves. But he is writing in a world that has a moral order, and in which supernatural things sometimes happen, and in which it matters if you kill a man while he's praying or if you kill him when he's not praying. Those are all things that matter in Shakespeare. And so that's, if we conceive of a world with God in it, you don't have to write God as a character. You simply have to write the world as it is with the God in it. That's a very different thing. Shakespeare, the biggest Shakespeare maven in the country, Stephen Greenblatt, says he's the most secular artist who ever lived. Go like, no, he just doesn't preach. He just leaves God in his heaven and shows what the world is like when there's a God in it. And so that's a very important point. I don't, listen, finding Christ was the great joy of my life, but that's not why I preach it. I preach it because it's true. I preach it because there is a God, just to start there. And if we don't start talking like that, if we're afraid to make that case, if we're afraid to say, no, people can't change their sex because there's something beautiful about being a woman. There's something beautiful about being a man. My friend Matt Walsh made that wonderful picture. What is woman? That's a tough question, because it's a primary word. It can't be defined. But we know it when we see it. And we know when somebody is womanly. We know when, somebody behaves in a feminine way. And we know, I always tell people, my wife, a very feminine woman, only has to walk into the room for the men to sort of sit up, like this, because that's
as it should be.
As it should be. And we have to write that world. And we have to tell stories in that world. And when you do that, you don't have to preach. You don't have to show people in church. You don't have to show anything. You just show the world as, in fact, it really is. And when a woman, like in this movie, Nora, does the things that she does, she degrades herself to a point that she doesn't recognize what she was made to be anymore. That's the story you should write.
And we can take that great lesson, and thank you for that wonderful response, and apply it to every arena.
Yep.
Politics, policy, obviously Hollywood. This is modern American culture, likes to be entertained. There's nothing intrinsically bad about that. In fact, it's intrinsically good in terms of leading a balanced life. But none other than Donald Trump has come up with this idea of ambassadors to Hollywood, right? Yeah. And he hasn't given them the charge, have them make more films that, cover God. He's talking about in using those very successful men and women of Hollywood to encourage, to exhort, to invest in projects in Hollywood that focus on the truth, on what's good and what's beautiful. And if you do those things, and there are consumers who are always willing to go pay for those things, then we might be getting somewhere in this cultural revolution.
Yeah, I mean, the people are there, the audience is there. If you make good stuff, you can't fund a film, because it's hard to make a good film, and you're not going to do it in one shot. You might, but it's not going to really do it. You have to fund a slate of films. You have to fund a studio. It can't just be films. It should be books, because that's where the IP comes from. That's where the material. Listen, most movies are not something somebody dreamed up. They're based on something, and you have to build all those venues. But again, what I like about the Hollywood ambassadors, I don't know if that's going to come to anything. The idea of people in Hollywood listening to the Trump government is hard to imagine. But I'm glad he took those three guys who are actual Hollywood artists, the three of them. I always say that Sylvester Stallone has that voice, so you think he's a palooka, but he's not. He's a very intelligent writer.
He is.
And, he's a good writer. And obviously, Gibson and John are like fantastic artists. I mean, in their field.
These are very accomplished men in this industry.
And people who have been, look, they haven't been blacklisted. Gibson, they came closest to, but they haven't really been blacklisted, but they've been muted because they're conservatives and because they're openly religious and they say the things that you're not supposed to say. And so I think it's good that they're honored. I think I'm happy to see these artists honored. And again, artists work for love. They really do. There's a reason people starve in garrets until they make it. It's because they want people to see what they can do. That wonderful Stephen Sondheim song, "Look, I Made a Hat Where There Never Was a Hat." That's in the heart of every artist. Look at what I made and love me, please. And we don't give them anything. We do not give them anything. And so just to honor them is a great thing. And who knows, they may accomplish something. You don't know.
And one of the things that leaders, I think, of any kind, but particularly presidents of the United States, have in their power, beyond the very obvious political, constitutional, legal authority they have, is a cultural power that I think Trump personifies as much as other presidents who've done that in our history, such as Teddy Roosevelt or Andrew Jackson. And what cultural leaders can do is remind us what our culture ought to honor and what it ought to dishonor. Yeah. And in an artistic way, in a way that you as a creative, very accomplished one would appreciate, you don't have to be that explicit about it as a leader. It's a matter of where you're investing your time, who your friends are, and who your friends aren't. So we'll at Heritage be keeping an eye on that and all cultural things. Andrew Klavan, I would actually spend the rest of this day talking to you about these things.
It's a pleasure.
So let's make this maybe the beginning of a series. This has been fantastic. We've covered a lot of ground, but I do want to ask you the one final proverbial question. And that is, in spite of all of the reasons that even with electoral success and policy success early on that we have to be encouraged, there are still plenty of Americans, including those on the center right, who think in the medium term and long term, especially post-Trump, that maybe the American Republic is in its waning days. Why did you wake up optimistic, however?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic. Look,
I could tell.
Well, one of the things that makes me optimistic is I have a tragic view of life. Everything dies, everything falls, empires fall,
Christian
countries
view.
fall. Right, exactly. And this is, I always tease Ben Shapiro because he's very down on everything. And I say he's always sorry that it's not 1956. I'm always thrilled it's not 1936. That's the difference. So I'm optimistic. We only have to win today. Everything dies, but it doesn't have to die today. We're in the position of doctors. You're going to lose, but you don't have to lose today. And this is a huge breakthrough. The corruption of our media is the most serious problem we've had. And the fact that media was rejected is an absolute breakthrough. Trump is a great instrument because he won't apologize, he won't stop, he won't slow down. I love him to death. That's the greatest thing. But these guys, the media has not figured out yet that we see them. They're like I compared.
They still haven't.
I compared them the other day to dinosaurs after the asteroid hit, and they're thinking, yes, that was a shock, but I hope it won't ruin my property values. It's like, no, it's over. You're done. You're toast. And so this is a great moment to build. And America, we build things. This is what we're good at. Elon Musk is a wonderful figure. He's a guy who wants to go to Mars. A kook, yeah. Great, be a kook, get us to Mars. That'll be great, And I think that artists, I think we're going to lose a generation of artists. I think we've lost this middle generation. But I think old guys like me who see it coming and young guys who have felt bottled up and haven't known why are going to break out. And I hope I live to see some of what these guys are going to do because I think it's going to be terrific. I think it's going to be a golden age. This has been the worst period. The last 10 years have been the worst period in culture, in the arts in America since I was born. I've never seen so much bad stuff, just dull, dead, empty stuff. You can't find a good TV show. You can't find a good movie. After a moment there when TV was fantastic at around 2000, everything is the same. Everything is, it's got to have mixed race couples. It's got to preach to you about this. It's got to preach to you about that. It was terrible. I think that that's about to explode. I think a generation is going to come up just says, we don't care what you think of us and we're going to do this thing. And I think we should be there to meet them with some of that love I know they're looking for.
Well, thanks for your advice. Thanks for your witness and being such a cheerful warrior. You're a national treasure.
Oh, that's so kind of you. You know, as I told you, I was so impressed when I saw you speak at Roger Kimball's gala. The Heritage Foundation has been at the center of this. You were the only guys who understood even a little of what I was saying when I started out 20 years ago. This was the only place where I could call them up and they'd go, yeah, we kind of get that, you know? And I get that that's not the center of your think tank, but I think it's an important institution. I appreciate the kind word.
No, you're kind. And I get the pleasure of working with tremendous colleagues as you do.
Yes.
And be sure to tell Jeremy and everyone at Daily Wire, I did say you were a national treasure.
All right. I don't, well, believe me. Well, I'm going to write it down right now. So.
Well, folks, thanks for making the show possible. I told you you'd enjoy the conversation. Obviously, tremendous amount of seriousness and substance, but it's also important as we engage in the culture that we remember our sense of humor. And I'll leave you with this. We've been thinking at Heritage over the last days and weeks, early in Trump's second term, about his concept of this golden age of America. And of course, we as conservative public policy people often will say that what that means is that it's conservative golden age in terms of policy. Really, it's a golden age in terms of American culture. And what Andrew's reminded us is each of us plays a role in that. Let's go out and seize it. Have fun.
The Kevin Roberts Show is brought to you by more than 10 million supporters of the Heritage Foundation. The executive producer is Crystal Kate Bonham. Sound design by Lauren Evans, Mark Guiney, Tim Kennedy, and Joseph von Spakovsky. For more information and to subscribe, please visit heritage.org.